The topic we're going to cover this evening is part of the amazing events that surround Israel coming out of Egypt. It's towards the end of that episode, as you probably all well know. And all of those events linked to this family of Abraham, the people that they turn into in Egypt, and the people that come out of Egypt and wander the wilderness, and then the nation that enters this promised land. All of these events are pregnant with types and signs, aren't they? They're dripping with types and signs. So this evening, I am not going to cover all of the types and signs which are covered in here, and I'm sure everybody in the audience will have a lovely nugget of type and sign that I've missed. Not, I hasten to add, because I didn't know about it, which is probably actually the case. My excuse is going to be that there's so much that I've dealt with a little slice of it, hopefully for this evening, and giving you some things to talk about in the discussion as well, obviously. So this evening we're going to look at just a couple of days towards the end of Israel getting to the Jordan, just before they go into the promised land. And this sort of slice of time that we're going to look at is only about 3 days, and there's a couple of problems that crop up in the record, and I'd like your opinion on it as well. 3 days from leaving Chittim to then being in Gilgal, and being at the edge of the Jordan, and then they go on into Gilgal, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But a very very small portion of time, and we have lots and lots of detail about it. A lot of detail, and the chapters. So the first few chapters in Joshua go through this event. They build up to the event, the handing over of power to Joshua, and then they have the events in chapters 3 and 4. And we'll look at both of those chapters in a little bit of detail before we've got some context. But let's do the context first, shall we? Let's see, how did we get to this position? How did we get to Joshua sending the Ark of the Covenant to the edge of flooded Jordan, and the priests with their toes in the edge of Jordan, and the amazing events that we've just heard Brother Tim read to us from Joshua chapter 3. Well, has everybody seen the Bible Project? Has everybody seen? Hands up who's seen the Bible Project. So there's quite a few people. So this is, I always go here just to get an overview of what are the aspects of a book. This is not a Christadelphian thing, so sometimes you might see some false doctrine, so please exercise caution. But it's a great way of seeing on one page the entire kind of flow of a book and getting the context for a book. Up in the top left we've got Abraham there and the nation of Israel, currently locked away. Can you see the chains around the nation of Israel? And that's their situation in Egypt. And then we have Moses coming on the scene, and then they've come out of Egypt, and we've got to have the Mount Sinai. We have the commandment. We have the covenant on Mount Sinai, and then we have the wilderness journey, and then we get to the plains of Moab. And in the plains of Moab, we have all these speeches. We have Deuteronomy, etc. And we have the obey, obey, obey. There's lots of references to obey, which we'll come to in a moment. And then we have these sections of the book. So we have the first 5 chapters seem to be dealing with the handover from Moses to Joshua, and then Joshua leading Israel. And there's some very positive leading that's happening from Joshua. And within those chapters are the events that happens that we're dealing with tonight, which is the passing over Jordan. And there's then a very interesting incident with the angel of the Lord appearing, and I'd like to discuss that all with you afterwards as well, because that's a really interesting incident where the angel of the Lord appears to Joshua just before the battles begin. And then we have the battles, and we have 2 very detailed battles. We have Jericho, where everything is smashing. And then we have Ai, where things are not so good. And those seem to be two scenarios where you obey and you're faithful, things will go well. They followed the ark, they blew the trumpets, they went round the right number of times, everything went well. With Ai, Achan, the troubler, failed, didn't he? He failed the whole of Israel. And he brought down on Israel all the things that happen, that we know happened after that defeat. And then we have lots of other interactions with the occupants of the land. So we don't need to go into those, it's not our subject. And then Joshua divides the land up, and there's a big word here that says boring. Okay, and if you were to listen to the voiceover, it would essentially say this may seem really boring. However, in this box it says that it's super important because it's the beginning of that fulfillment of the promises to Abraham. So really important, that division of the land, and that comes under in these chapters here in Joshua. And then you have the final words of Joshua, which have some very similar aspects to those of Moses, about obedience and making a choice. What are you going to do, Israel? What are you going to do? Who are you going to choose? Now let's have a look at some maps, because we like maps. So we have here Kadesh Barnea, and obviously there's the previous attempt to send spies and get a report back, etc. And then there was the continued wandering in the wilderness, which this is a possible route. There's another possible route that goes down here and then cuts up the King's Highway, and not a debate for today. And then they end up in Abel Chittim, which is obviously Chittim, which we have here. But some other stuff has happened after that. They didn't get there and then immediately go over. What they did was they then went, and this is obviously still under Moses, they then went up and conquered Og, king of Bashan. If you remember Og, king of Bashan, that's linked with the giants. So they were coming against the giants, which the other spies had said, not a chance, there's giants in the land, it's terrible, they've got massive walled villages, we cannot possibly attack these people. And what do? Well, they go up, first of all, and they go and attack, and Og comes down, and they meet at Edrei, and Og is defeated. So immediately the message is, if you follow the servant of God, Moses, then that you will be able to defeat anybody that comes against you. And that again was a message, wasn't it, that Caleb and Joshua reported back as faithful spies. And then they loop back down, and then they end up back in Moab. So this is here, can you see there's a line that comes down here, which is essentially down here, through Ammon, back round, up, and then through that Moab, and then they end up in these plains of Moab, across from Jericho, and this is where Deuteronomy, all the speeches in Deuteronomy are delivered, and all the things that we see there, and the handing over of power. We have the Mount Nebo there, which is obviously where Moses went up to view the land. So this is the context. This is the context of the very small slice of time. Israel had gone through an amazing amount of travel. They'd gone conquering nations. They had obviously had all of the experiences, the destruction of an entire generation, and now they come to stand on the shore, or very close to the shore. In Chittim, they're probably a few days' journey away from the Jordan. Now, let's now look at the maps. So these next two maps you're going to have to keep in your head, because I'm not going to keep putting them up. Okay, but these are maps relating to the events in these chapters. So we have Chittim there. We have the Jordan there. The descender, which is one interpretation of the river descending. We see lots of links, don't we, with life, the descender coming down, and the crossing of this Jordan into this promised land and towards Jericho. Now these lines here are the lines of the spies. So the spies is chapter 2. Okay, so chapter 1, the handover of power and command to Joshua and the be strong and of good courage, etc. And then you've got the spies being sent out. It's interesting that right at the beginning of chapter 2, if you look at the beginning of chapter, it says, Joshua the son of Nun sent out of Chittim 2 men to spy secretly. And there is a problem with the timeline here. Does anybody know what the problem with the timeline is? So the timeline problem is that in verse 22 of that chapter, it says that they went into the mountains for 3 days to hide. Now, what had Joshua said in chapter 1? Joshua had said in chapter 1 somewhere that verse 11, pass through the host and command the people, saying, prepare you victuals, for within 3 days ye shall pass over this Jordan. So there's 3 days from Chittim to passing the Jordan, and these spies are in the mountains for three days. What's going on there? Now there's several answers that I've seen in different commentators, which are that the 3 days from the 3 days of preparation, maybe that there's 3 days of travel, that there was actually, and this may be more appropriate, which was the 3 days started, but Joshua had already sent out the spies prior to that, because some interpretations of that verse 1 of chapter 2 say, and Joshua the son of Nun had sent out, and you can see that in your AV margin, or in mine definitely it says had sent. So previously to all this stuff, he had sent out the spies, and that would then fix the timeline potentially. And the timeline was really critical, because they had to be over the Jordan and into the land to do the Passover. And the Passover was in Gilgal, and it was on the 14th of Abib. And they passed over the other side of the Jordan, and when they landed on the other side of the Jordan, then they got onto the other side of the Jordan, it was the 10th day of Abib. And the 10th day of Abib was when they selected the lamb. So they got over into the land, the promised land. All of this is pregnant with type, isn't it, and sign. I'm sure you're going to give me some beautiful types and signs for this, because I'm not. Okay, so they get in there, and the lamb is chosen, and then they go in, and they go on a few days' journey, and then they get to Gilgal, and do some other stuff we could talk about, and then do the Passover. So the timeline was critical, and they needed to get over the other side of Jordan in order for this to happen, for them to have this first Passover in the land. This is then a map of this is the journeys then. So the spies have come back, and it says that the spies came back and spoke to Joshua, and so that timeline of 3 days must have been from the time when they came back to Shittim, and they rose early. So can you see in at the end of chapter 2, and they said to Joshua, no it doesn't, 23, and the 2 men returned and descended from the mountains and passed over and came to Joshua the son of Nun. So they came back, and then Joshua then rose up from Chittim. So this here is the travelling of the nation, headed by the tribes which would be over this side. So Reuben, Gad, and Manasseh, I think, and they went across and over to Gilgal, which is what we'll mention, and then, not in our subject, they then went on to Jericho, having done some really interesting things before they went to Jericho. Again, we don't want to do any spoilers, But they did some really interesting things before then going on and defeating these people. So let's now look at some themes, shall we? So there's a repeated theme, and there's something that I've mentioned a few times, and it came upon that the Bible Project description of Joshua, the book of Joshua, which is the theme to obey, and it's repeated throughout this section of Scripture. So if you just go back to the end of Moses' speeches, so you have the very famous speech in Deuteronomy 30, and that's the whole choice. That's the choice speech, and that's where he said in verse 19, "I call upon heaven and earth, record this day that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore choose life, that thy seed may live." And verse 20, "That thou mayest love the Lord your God, and that thou mayest obey his voice, and that thou mayest cleave unto him, for he is thy life and thy length of thy days." So this theme of obedience really is rammed home in these last chapters. So the handover from Moses to Joshua is full of all of this obedience. Joshua himself is told to obey. "Only be strong and of courage, that thou mayest observe to do according to all the law which Moses thy servant commanded thee." So it's you've got to do like Moses did, observe the law, to obey. And you'll see as if you read through these with this obedience filter on, you'll see lots of occurrences of obedience in these very first chapters of Joshua. 16 as well of this same chapter. "And they answered Joshua." Now this is now the people. So this is the leaders of Israel now. They've been spoken to. "And they answered Joshua and said, All that thou commandest to do, we will do. Whithersoever thou sendest us, we will go. According as we have hearkened unto Moses in all things, so will we hearken unto thee. Only the Lord thy God be with you, as he has been with Moses." And then he says, so that's fine. So that's essentially them saying, we will follow you and we will obey you as long as God is with you. Or it says, "Only the Lord thy God be with thee, as he was with Moses." And they had just had some amazing evidence that God was with Moses. They'd just been up and defeated those nations, hadn't they? And they'd come back into the plains of Moab. So they'd seen some amazing things. Now this was obviously the generation that hadn't seen the Red Sea. This was the generation that was seeing new things happen, and evidence for God being, or Moses being a man of God. And then also in chapter 3 and verse 3, a repetition of this theme, and they commanded the people, saying, "When you see the ark of the covenant of the Lord your God, and the priests and the Levites bearing, you shall remove from your place." So that's just an example of Joshua. He was commanding them like crazy. He was telling them to do all sorts of things. Go, as you see it, if you see the ark being lifted up, stay 2,000 cubits away, etc., etc. All these things. Get some stones, put the stones here, carry them over here, Reubenites over there, etc. There was loads of commands that Joshua was giving them, and they were doing the things that he asked. And I think, and that was not always the case with Israel, was it? So in these first few chapters, there seems to be like this almost amazing rosy picture of Israel following, being obedient. And it reminded me of the first few chapters of the Acts of the Apostles, where they were all in one place with one accord. And I think there's a lot of links between the fellowship and the things that happen in these chapters with the early ecclesial life and the things that happened in that early ecclesial life. And the kind of unity of mind that was in those times. It didn't take too long, did it, before Ananias and Sapphira, and the things kind of went a bit wrong, didn't they? And things started to slip up. And the same thing with Israel. Everything was fine until they got to Ai, and then things started to slip up, didn't they? So there's maybe an example here of the times of the Gentiles, or the times of the creation of ecclesial life, and I'm sure you would find lots of evidence of that if you looked further as well. So anyway, the next evidence, or the next thing, is about crossing over. And crossing over, I won't mention this much, apart from the fact that if you look at chapters 3 and 4, there are 19 occurrences of the phrase to pass over, or to cross over. Lots and lots of examples of this, and it seems almost like it's been woven into these two chapters in order to emphasise that fact. They're crossing over from one place to another. They're going from one position to another position. They're going from this people into a nation. They're going from people to a nation. And that's the transition that they make through this baptism, through just like their fathers and mothers had done previously, so are they. Right, we also see a theme of similar actions to Moses. So very much like Elisha taking over from Elijah, and John the Baptist, etc. We see similarities between these people who are put together within a similar context. So we see them both baptizing the people. We see them both sending spies. Now, Joshua sending spies was a lot more successful than Moses sending the spies, but that was the same intent was there. Both had this call to obey. And then in Deuteronomy we have this giving of glory, and for time I won't look at these verses, but if you were to look at those, this is about basically having messages being passed to do with remembrance and witnesses. That's what you would see in Deuteronomy, to do with remembrance and witnesses for coming generations. Like the testimony was a witness, and the 12 stones are a witness here with Joshua. And this last one in Exodus is all to do with giving God glory and being gloried themselves and being exalted themselves. Just have a look, one example of that. Joshua 4 verse 14, and on that day the Lord magnified Joshua in the sight of all Israel, and they feared him as they feared Moses all the days of his life. And so there's this similarity there. Now, time is going, so let's crack on with some other interesting things that I found in the context of this situation. Now, obviously, when they were in Egypt, they were amongst enemies. Okay, and we had this process of them being amongst enemies, having this Passover. This Passover is this salvation, being with the angel of the Lord passing over, due to the fact that the blood was on the pillars and the crossbeam of the houses, etc. Then they went through the Red Sea, this baptism event. Then they went through the wandering in the wilderness. Then, obviously, there was this transition to this new generation. The new generation then experienced things slightly different order. So then they had the baptism, they had the Passover, and then they had the enemies. And so you have this symmetry within the things that happened to Israel, exiting Egypt and then attacking the enemies, were the two kind of the opposites there. And in between here, we have these two Passovers, and these are kind of milestones within this time period. These milestones are this 40 years between, and the Passover was really important because it gave them the first month. When their Passover was given, all those events happened. They said, this is going to be the first month of your calendar. Incredible. This is like, literally, imagine doing that now, right? So amazing event happens. It's July the 23rd, and right, scrap everything. This is the calendar. This is month 1. Okay, month 1 and year 1 starts here. And then you have this 40 years, and on the anniversary of that, you end up being in the promised land. And there's obviously a huge type there, isn't there, of this transition, this travelling through this life of probation and entering this rest within within the promised land. Right, let's stop looking at context now, and let's dive into some of the nitty-gritty of the passage. So we've dealt with the first point there, which was the whole 3 days Passover thing and the difficulty around that. And then we have Joshua chapter 1. Okay, so Joshua 3 verse 1. In this Joshua 3 verse 1, this is the beginning of an amazing series of days. And what does Joshua do? Does he snooze his alarm? No, he doesn't. He gets up early. He rose early. He was ready for this amazing event to happen. Joshua rose up early in the morning and they removed from Chittim. And so that there, I think, if you look at the context of our own lives, that there is an amazing example of getting up early and getting things done, taking opportunity while opportunity exists. And that really is a really amazing example here of Joshua demonstrating this example. Do you remember the prophet who was told to go and deliver a message, and he delivered the message and he said, don't stop on the way back? And he stopped on the way back and he went back to somebody's house for tea, didn't he? Now, one of the things that started the problem there, do you remember what he was doing when the man approached him? Can you remember what he was doing? He was sitting down, resting. Sitting down, resting. What he should have been doing is travelling. He should have been up and at it. He should have been travelling home. And the time now is not for resting. The time now is for getting on with it. And that really is an example of Joshua, isn't it, here? He was ready and willing to lead these people towards Jordan. Now remember, Jordan was swollen banks. It was very large. This part of the river, you might have been, in another season, you might have been able to pass it. It might have been the ford Beth Arabah, which you might have been able to go across. I mean, maybe not an entire nation, but at least some people may have been able to go across. But this was swollen banks. This was a really large, fast-flowing river. Okay, and they were going towards it. And these people were doing as they were told, as we see here. They passed through and they got themselves ready, and they in verse 1, they lodged there and they passed over, and they came to pass after 3 days. The officers went throughout the host, and they gave some further instructions. Verse 3, and they commanded the people, saying, when ye see the ark of the covenant of the Lord and the priests bearing it, ye shall remove from your place and go after it. And so you have this man, Joshua, obviously Jehoshua, and his name was changed, wasn't it, by Moses from Hoshua to Jehoshua, Yahweh saves, was taking them now into the land. And it was not a path that they had been before. Okay, that's what it says here in verse 4. It says, yet ye shall be space between you and it, the ark, and 2,000 cubits by measure. Come not near unto it, that ye may know the way by which ye must go, for you have not passed this way heretofore. Now, how amazing is that type? That just that verse is bubbling with type, isn't it? Because in there we have links pointing forward to Christ, being that forerunner. And man, it is not in man to know. It's not in man to know. You don't know the way to go. You've not passed here before, have you? You don't know the way to save yourself. So Christ being the first fruits, in 1 Corinthians 15, we know that, don't we? We know that it says, but now is Christ risen from the dead, and become the first fruits of them that slept. For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead, for in in Adam all die, even so in Adam shall all be made alive. And so we have this first fruits, Christ the first fruits. Afterward, they that are Christ at his coming, then cometh the end. And that's then cometh the end, which is then later on. And he shall, when he shall delivered up the kingdom of God. It's the millennium age. And so we have, don't we, this idea of Joshua saying, look, this is the way, go and follow this. And there's going to be somebody who's going to lead the way for you, and it's going to highlight the way. Now, from a practical point of view, it might have been easier for the nation to be able to observe what's going on. And this was about half a mile, this 2,000 cubits, about half a mile. Be able to look where these people are going and be able to then direct them. But I think the typical significance is really, really weighted in the things that are contained in this verse. And then it says, it talks about in verse 5, Joshua said unto the people, sanctify yourself, for tomorrow the Lord will do wonders among you. Sanctify yourself. And that's being cleansed or being separated specifically. Then wonders will be seen. And it's very similar language to language used in Exodus when Moses delivers and goes up to Mount Sinai for the law. The same, they were to consecrate themselves. They were to sanctify themselves. And also verse 10, Joshua said, hereby shall ye know that the living God is among you. Verse 10. These are the wonders which are shown from the ongoing conquering of all of these nations. Okay, let's move on. We then get down to, so we have this sanctifying, we then have verse 7 is when it actually happens. Thou shalt bear the ark, and they go and they go towards the Jordan, and Joshua then gives the come hither and hear the words of the Lord command in verse 9. In verse 11 we then have, behold, the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth passeth over before you into Jordan. The covenant of the Lord. And that there, it's really interesting that the terminology that's used there, behold, the ark of the Lord of all the earth passeth over before you into Jordan. Of all the earth. Why does it all of a sudden mention the ark of the covenant of the Lord of all the earth? And that Lord there is Adon, which is master or ruler. Ruler of the whole earth. And we start to see types coming out with linking to other nations getting the benefit from God. Other nations getting the benefit from God. Right, so let's move on to the next part, which is then verse 13. We now see that there's this identification of 12 people, and we're going to dwell on the 12 people when we get into chapter 4. But in verse 13 here we have the identification of these 12 people. Just incidentally, as a side note, this identification of 12 people from every tribe went a lot better with Joshua than it did with Moses. If you remember, Moses, these 12 people, 10 of them brought bad reports. Here, these 12 people seem to be obeying. They're obeying and following and doing the things that they're told to do. Not bringing a faithful report in this case, but doing something else. And then verse 16, this is now when we have the amazing events of this swollen river experiencing the power of God, and the things that in halting the flow of this water so these people can go across. So the priests have gone in and they've dipped their toes in the brim of the water, as we see in verse 15, for the Jordan overflowed all its banks on this time of harvest. So it's not even within the banks, it's like it's across the side of the banks, it's in flood and it's flowing fast. It's difficult to cross, a difficult barrier for a nation to cross. But God is going to provide a way through this. Then verse 16, that the waters which came down from above rose up into a heap very far from the city of Adam beside Zaratan. So that, if you remember on the map, in fact the map's there, look. So Adam is up there. So it seems to, the events that happened up there have impacted what happens down where Israel are crossing. And it's thought that it was probably an earthquake that happened and caused some kind of landslide. Now, obviously, yeah, it's still natural causes and whatnot, but obviously it was timed perfectly, wasn't it? So it was the hand of God using these naturally occurring events to demonstrate his power and to get Israel across. And there's just some notes here I've got, which this apparently means that the water was stopped as far upriver as Adam, identified as some other place now, east of the Jordan and just south of the confluence with the Jabbok River, about 18 miles north of the fords of Jordan. It is a place where mudslides have occasionally completely blocked the Jordan's southward flow, most recently in 1927 for some 20 hours. And so, yes, there's an explanation for that, but it was brought about exactly at the right point by God in order to demonstrate this event and his power. Okay, let's move on into, because we haven't got too much time, and I want to spend quite a bit of time on the 12 men. When I say a lot of time, I mean like hours. Okay, so let's go into so verse 17 of this chapter is interesting because of the term it uses to describe Israel and the priests. And the priests that bear the ark of the Lord stood firm on dry ground in the midst of Jordan, and all the Israelites passed over the dry ground, and all the people were passed clean over Jordan. Now in the AV that's translated people. If you've got other versions, you'll probably see that that's nation. And that's the first time that they are referred to in that terms as in you are their nation. Now it's not the first time that they are. It says that they will be a great nation, because it talks about that, doesn't it, in the promises, etc. But that's all in prospect. Here we have the first time when they say this is the nation, when the whole nation passed over, and they're referring to them in that way. So I thought that was an interesting, and maybe there's a transition there from the family that go into Egypt, the people that come out of Egypt, and the nation that go into Israel, and those terminologies which are used of Israel. Now let's move on to the 12 men, 12 tribes and 12 stones, because I think this is a very interesting incident. And there's a slightly confusing verse. I like confusing verses. It's verse 9, but we will come to that in a moment. Let's have a look. Let's have a look at verse 3 first of all. So let's go into Joshua chapter 4 and look in verse 3. And he commanded, and command ye them, saying, so this is then instructions to these 12 men that have been taken out of every tribe. Take you hence out of the midst of Jordan, out of the place where the priest's feet stood firm, 12 stones, and ye shall carry them over with you, and leave them in the lodging place where you shall lodge tonight. So we have these 12 stones, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to look at some other times that 12 stones are going to be used, and I'll look at the occurrences of this in this chapter, the kind of repetition in this chapter. These are the kind of two things I'm going to look at today. So first of all, 12 stones which are Israelitish. I mean, there's like Israelitish stuff all over this, isn't there? There's 12, first of all. There's one from every tribe. It's Israelitish is what it's trying to say here. This is Israelitish. It's stuff to do with the nation of Israel. Yeah, that's what it's trying to say to us here. And where else has these types been used? Well, let's have a look in Exodus. When they were emblazoned on the front of the breastplate of the priest, weren't they? So Exodus 39 and verse 5, we have the curious girdle of the ephod which was upon it, and the same according to the work thereof. gold, blue, purple, scarlet, fine twined linen, etc. This is the ephod. This is the cuirass girdle that's going to go on the ephod, the clothing of this priest. And then let's have a look in verse 6. These are different stones, which all have the names of the children of Israel on, in verse 6. You shall put them on the shoulders of the ephod, and the stones for a memorial to the children of Israel. Remember that word, because that's literally what the stones out of Jordon are for. They're for a memorial. They are for people to remember an event. So these 12 stones, it's not, 12 stones have been used before in order to do this. And in this case, it's the 12 stones of the breastplate. Right, the next time 12 stones are used is to remember something, is when Elijah has a bit of a contretemps with the prophets of Baal, if you remember. And what does he build the altar of? Well, he rebuilds an altar, actually, doesn't he? He built an altar that should have been there and should have been serviceable previously, but he actually rebuilds the altar of the Lord. And what does he use? 1 Kings 18 verse 30. And Elijah came near, all the people came near, and he repaired the altar of the Lord that was broken down. And Elijah took 12 stones according to the number of the tribes of the sons of Jacob. Again, 12 stones are used, linked with the tribes. Again, so this is a repeated theme, isn't it? Time and time again, these stones are used. And the final one, there's probably others, and please do contribute to these types later on. But in Revelation, we have this New Jerusalem, which is explained in chapter 21. And in chapter 21, I saw a new heaven and a new earth, etc. And we have this really beautiful description, don't we, of Jerusalem, a holy city, a great city and a holy Jerusalem descending from heaven, verse 10. But what are some of the terms that it uses when relating to this? I've just got loads of verses there, haven't I? So I need to try and pick one out now. Well, there's loads. Oh, here we go. So there's foundations of the walls of the city. Well, first of all, there's 12 gates. Okay, so there's 12 gates and they're all made of pearl. So that's something. And then there's 12 foundations. And what are the foundations? It links them to the apostles. And then it links the colours of these as well. So the sardonyx, sardius, chrysolite, etc. are all of these different stones which are used. 12 gates were 12 pearls, verse 21, and several gates of 1 pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold. And so we have these stones being used. There's some stones to do with the foundation. Can somebody find that verse about 12 stones to do with the apostles? 14. Oh yeah, thank you. And the wall of the city had 12 foundations, and in them were the names of the 12 apostles of the Lamb. There we go. So we have these foundations, and we have these 12 apostles. So we have tribes, apostles, all linked to this 12, and stones, and being used as these stones. And you can again see the types. Peter, upon this rock thou shalt build my church. The rock being the gospel, the proclamation. And that's what these people were building. They were building this beautiful city that was described in these figurative terms in Revelation. 12 stones, 12 men. 12 men, 12 stones, 12 tribes. It's probably best to tribes, men, stones, isn't it? This is repeated multiple times in this chapter. Verse 3. So the whole incident here, the fact that they needed 12 men to go into the river, pick up 12 stones and take them where they lodged and put them down, is repeated time and time again in this chapter. I'll go all the way back to Joshua now. So, all the way from Revelation to Joshua. So back in Joshua chapter 4, we have verse 3. What does it say in verse 3? Well, first of all, we have the instructions of who? We have Joshua giving instructions to the officers, and they commanded the people, saying, so verse 3, and commanded ye them, saying, take you hence out of the midst of Jordan, out of the place where the priests' feet stood firm, 12 stones, and you shall carry them over with you, and leave them in the lodging place where you shall lodge tonight. That's the first time that this instruction is given in this chapter. So this is this instruction to take these 12 stones. You then have a repetition of that in verses 4 through to 7. So you have them. Then answered they then ye shall answer them that the waters of Jordan were cut off from the ark of the covenant of the Lord. Then when it passed over Jordan, the waters of Jordan were cut off, and these stones shall be a memorial unto the children of Israel forever. So that's a repetition there. So that's Joshua to the 12 men. So first of all, the Lord tells Joshua the instructions in verse 3. Verses 4 to 7, Joshua tells the 12 men the instructions, which is interesting. This is transfer of the instructions. And then verse 8, we then have them obeying those instructions. So the children of Israel did so as Joshua commanded, and they took the 12 stones in the midst of the Jordan, and they spake, and according to the number of the tribes, so they carried them over, and they lodged, and they laid them down there. So they have them actually doing the action in verse 8, and then we get the troublesome verse, I think, because then it says, and Joshua set up 12 stones in the midst of Jordan, in the place where the feet of the priests which bear the ark of the covenant stood, and they were there until this day. So then you've got this situation where you've got, so they're told to go and get stones from the feet of the priests who are in the middle of the Jordan, and there's 12 men take these stones across and to the other side, and now you've got Joshua, it says here, Joshua setting up 12 stones, putting them back under the feet. So there's like this setting up where they are in the middle of Jordan. Now what in earth is that all about? Again, there's a couple of possibilities there. The first possibility is that yes, indeed, Joshua did then take another 12 stones and put them in the middle of the river. And in the middle of the river you then have this monument which protrudes from the waves, and people then can see that monument of 12 stones in the river. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that the language that here is actually referring to, because it's very similar language, isn't it, to verse 3, where it says, out of the place where the priest's feet stood firm, the 12 stones you shall carry them over. It's very similar language, basically placing under the feet of the priests in verse 9. And the language may be actually referring and having a summary of the fact that Joshua actually did, or under Joshua's commandment, this action was carried out. That's one possibility. I'm not certain actually what the answer to this question is, but in Young's literal version it reads like this. And the sons of Israel do so as Joshua commanded, and take up 12 stones out of the midst of Jordan, as Jehovah had spoken to Joshua according to the number of the tribes, the sons of Israel, and remove them to over with them unto the lodging place, and place them there. Right, that's verse 8. Verse 9, even the 12 stones hath Joshua raised up out of the midst of Jordan, the place of the standing of the feet of the priests bearing the ark of the covenant, and they are there unto this day. So I don't really know, and I'd like to get people's feedback on that. To me, it seems that the type is to take these stones out from where underneath the feet of the priests, and to place them on the bank, and that be the memorial place, the place where they go to, the lodging place. Now, and I haven't got strong views either way, but that seemed to me like there was the 12 stones were the 12 stones which were carried out and put onto the side, and there wasn't necessarily others stood up in the middle of the river. Because there seems to be this constant repetition of these events to make the point. Because then they're again reviewed again in verse 20. And those 12 stones which they took out of Jordan did Joshua pitch in Gilgal. And it says Joshua pitched them there, didn't it? And maybe that's again the similar terminology to, I mean, actually the 12 men took them out. And it says that Joshua did it in verse 9. Maybe it's just under Joshua's command these things happened. And those 12 stones which they took out of Jordan did Joshua pitch in Gilgal. And verse 24, that all the people of the earth might know that the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, and that ye might fear the Lord your God forever. And this is the really interesting part. Okay, so now we've got these 12 stones which have been brought out, they've been put on the bank. What is the point of them being put on the bank? The point of them being put on the bank is that people might look at them, and you might teach your children. That's what it keeps saying repeatedly. It says that in this verse, that the children of Israel, or you may teach your children what has happened in this place. But the other thing is that what? All the people of the earth, there's that phrase again, all the people of the earth might know the hand of the Lord, that it is mighty, that ye might fear the Lord your God forever. So I think there's two parts to that, or two kind of interpretations of that. And I think the first interpretation is, people will look at these stones and they will think the God that is the God of Israel is a mighty God, and one that we should fear, one that we should reverence. And there was already a convertee to that, which was Rahab. Rahab had already seen that, and she was already fearing, and she'd already converted. But also the other thing, the other type of fear would be to be absolutely, terrified of what's happened. These people have just magnificently been brought into this land through this Jordan and placed into this land to take possession of it. And now there's this monument. When we go out fishing in the Jordan, we walk past this 12-stone monument that these people have come in to take a possession. And the God of Israel has helped them to do that. So there's just two aspects there, I think. And there is a link here with, potentially, and it's not certain, with Beth Arabah, which John the Baptist was... remember, John the Baptist was on the east side of Jordan, baptising at Beth Arabah. And that was when he was saying to the Pharisees, of these stones I can raise up children. And maybe it was these stones that he was looking at. Maybe it was the stones that were in the middle of Jordan as well. I don't know. I'd like to have some discussion about that afterwards, if you have a view on that. So I think this whole incident of 12 men, 12 tribes, 12 men, 12 tribes, 12 men and 12 stones is really interesting. And essentially it encapsulates the Israelitish hope, and the Israelitish hope being opened up to many nations, to all nations. All people might know the might of your hand, and there may be a witness. Israel will be a witness to all nations, that they can turn and look at him, and they can see that he is a true God. Right, now let's see. Yeah, okay, that's fine. So, all nations of the earth, so we've already talked about that. So, just very briefly, some really interesting things happened directly after this event. So, before they go charging up against Jericho, well, they don't charge; they do it in a very ordered manner, obviously. But before they go against Jericho, they do some preparation, and the preparation is interesting. They are circumcised. So the men in the wilderness, which is interesting, isn't it? That the men in the wilderness obviously didn't go through this 8th day circumcision process. and they needed circumcising, and so that's what happened in chapter 5. And they also incredibly kept this Passover, and that must have been a really emotional time for them. The keeping of this Passover feast 40 years after it was created, and they were now in the place where they'd all been striving to get to for all this time, and they were now eating this Passover feast for the first time ever in the Promised Land. What an amazingly emotional time that would have been for these people. Looking at these 12 stones, obeying God, and the spirit of these people would have been really elated, wouldn't it? They've just had seen this amazing thing, and they're just about to go and have that confidence boosted even further with the defeat of Jericho. So these people are on the rise. They're unstoppable. And they're unstoppable because of their faith and obedience in a God that has brought them through this, set up this monument to be remembered by, and this feast to demonstrate the salvation, the salvation that they've had exiting from Egypt. And now they've got to this land. Now, just as we conclude, let's have a look at kind of a summary of the types and signs that we've seen, but do it in a kind of diagrammatic form, hopefully. So, this is the general flow of what happened in these years, the nation of Israel. And you've got exiting Egypt, you've got them going through the Red Sea, wandering in the wilderness, and entering the Promised Land. And it doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out how that links to us, does it? The things that links to is the world, coming out of the world, being baptised, this walk, this probationary walk, and then entering into this rest. It's interesting that the Reubenites, etc., they said, you mustn't come back here until you've given your brethren rest. That was the point, wasn't it? Take a possession before you've given your brethren rest. They were going into this land for rest, and that is a huge sign, isn't it? A huge type of the kingdom. But I think if we just look at these few days that we've got here, there might be some other themes that we get from it which link to ourselves, and maybe also link to the times that we live in, and definitely lessons that we can gain. So first of all, we have, don't we, teaching, the ideas that flow from this are teaching to obey. So this receiving of teaching and being told to have obedience, being sanctified, being ready to see wonders. That's the thing that happened to this nation. Being told to follow, and being told that this is a path that you've not been on before, but look over there in the distance, somebody has already been there. Somebody is doing this route for you, and you can watch it and you can see where you need to go. Crossing over from one state of mind to another. And so going from this fleshly outlook to a more heavenly, the heavenlies. We then have this amazing event of the 12 stones, this memorial, which is being placed for people to remember and have a witness. Okay, to have a witness. And that we look, don't we? We look to the Jews as God's witnesses. We look to things Israelitish to witness to God. We then see the circumcision and this cutting off of the flesh, and we see that, don't we, as a theme for ourselves. Sacrificing our own lives and the things and our own will and our own purpose for things spiritual, for gaining spiritual blessing. And then we also have the Passover, and this feast held in this place of rest, remembering Christ, remembering the thing that sacrificed, this lamb that was sacrificed for us. And don't we do that every Sunday? We remember, don't we, this sacrifice that was made for us. And so we see, I think, encapsulating all of these themes, if we go into Acts of the Apostles, going on a bit here, Acts of the Apostles, chapter 26, and we'll just finish with this. Verse 16. But rise and stand upon thy feet. This is This is Paul speaking to and giving his defence. But rise, and this is what happened when he was on the where was he? He was on the road from Damascus, of course. But rise and stand upon thy feet, Jesus says, for I have appeared unto thee for this purpose, to make thee a minister and a witness both of those things which thou hast seen and those things which have appeared unto thee, delivering thee from the people and from the Gentiles, whom now I send thee, to open their eyes and turn from darkness to light, this crossing over from one side of the river to another, from the power of Satan unto God, they that receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance into the land, among them which are sanctified. They've been sanctified. How? By faith which is in me. And so we see encapsulated in these things in the New Testament the themes that we saw in crossing this river. And so let's look to these signs and types, and let us make sure that we let us labour therefore to enter into that rest.